Welcome everybody. We are getting ready to start tonight's symposium here at the Nashville Parthenon with all of you joining us on Zoom. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Katie Petroli. I am the Assistant Director here at the Nashville Parthenon and the Outreach Coordinator for AIA Nashville Society. And I also serve as the VP of Societies for the Archaeological Institute of America. Today's lecture is available in American Sign Language with interpretation provided by Bridges for the deaf and hard of hearing. Please use the desktop version of Zoom to access. After our presentation tonight, we will have time for questions. You can use the Q&A function to ask your question, or you're also welcome to use the chat. I'll be looking in there for any questions as well. I'd like to thank Centennial Park Conservancy and Metro Nashville Parks and Recreation for their support of tonight's program. Without funding from Centennial Park Conservancy, educational programs like our Symposia series could not be possible. I'd also like to announce we have a very special sponsorship for tonight's lecture. In honor of James and Jenny Russell, the Archaeological Institute of America has established an annual special lecture, which was generously funded by an anonymous donor. James Russell is a professor emeritus of Greek and Roman art and archaeology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And he was also the president of the Institute from 1992 to 1994. He's had a long and celebrated career in classical archaeology. And in addition to research and teaching in the fields of Roman and early Byzantine art and archaeology, Greek and Latin epigraphy, Roman Palestine, the Roman army, and early Christianity, Russell is perhaps best known for his work at Anamurium, a small Roman and Byzantine city on the south coast of Turkey. Between 1970 and 1987, Russell directed excavations there, exploring a variety of public and private buildings dating from the 2nd to 7th centuries, shedding new light on the city's economic and social life. And the James and Jenny Russell Lecture is given annually on a topic of archaeological interest. And we are so thrilled to share with you an archaeological talk by Dr. Christopher Beekman. Dr. Christopher Beekman is a professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado, Denver. His research focuses on socio-political practices in ancient Western Mexico and the region's interactions with its neighbors. His books include Shaft Tombs and Figures in West Mexican Society, edited with Robert Pickering, and his most recent is Waves of Influence, Pacific Maritime Networks Connecting Mexico, Central America, and Northwestern South America, edited with Colin McEwen. He received his PhD right here in Nashville from Vanderbilt University. Welcome, Dr. Beekman, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you very much to Bonnie Seymour, the Parthenon, who invited me into the AIA for their support and having me here as well. And Helen Sanders and Katie Petrol have been excellent at doing so much work in making all of this possible. Thank you all. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you here today at the Parthenon. I'll be providing an updated view of on what have sometimes been called the shaft tomb figures of Western Mexico. My first opportunity to directly handle the figures that I will be discussing today actually came in 1992, right here at the Parthenon. I know, I don't look it, but it really was 1992. Director Wesley Payne invited me to research a collection of figures that had been donated. Those very figures were recently repatriated to Mexico in a significant effort by the folks here, for which they should very definitely be congratulated. Thank you all for your work. So let's take a look here. Let's get started. In this map, you can see the broader region of Mesoamerica, this area between North and South America, and an attempt to sort of break the region of Mesoamerica into sort of the sub areas, some better known, such as the Maya of the far southeastern part of Mesoamerica, or maybe Teotihuacan or the Aztecs of central Mexico. You may notice a certain ambivalence about the material in Western Mexico on this map. Their position out there in the far west, they're sort of lumped in with the deserts of northern Mexico and the American Southwest. Still, other scholars have pointed to maritime links further to the south, things I've looked at as well. My goal today is not to choose between these affiliations, all of which are real at different times, but rather to demystify some of the best known archaeological remains of Western Mexico. I am, of course, referring to the burial of the dead in deep shaft and chamber tombs over a span of some 500 years or so, and the presence of one or more hollow ceramic figures as associated offerings. So in the slide here, the artsy little black and white line drawing shows a deep vertical shaft, in this case some 20 meters or 60 feet below the ground surface, leading down to 3 subterranean chambers where the dead were laid out. Alongside them could be objects of various kinds, imported jade, shell from the coast, or materials from elsewhere. But the elements that have been of so much interest to people outside of the region have been the hollow ceramic figures, such as the one you see in the lower right, or in some rare cases, actual models that show architecture and people doing things in that architecture in the upper right. Now, these objects have been characterized for decades as the product of a very simple village societies without any sort of rulers or gods. Clearly a major contrast with, let's say, the pyramid building peoples of other areas in Mesoamerica. So the models that you can see, for instance, in the upper right, were interpreted as entire villages and depicting daily life. Now, these materials are distributed across a wide range of Western Mexico. We can get a sense of it here, this sort of arc running through the outlined area that's there. You can see the states of Nayarit and Jalisco and Colima that have been outlined. The red arc illustrates where so many of these shaft tombs are found. But at the same time, they're also found in pockets throughout the broader region that you can see here. Sometimes you find the tombs without the figures, sometimes you find the figures without the tombs, but they're usually thought of as something that go together. Now, although these figures had been they've been known for a great period of time. The first ones identified during construction in the 1700s, but the figures came to be very important on the art market in the 20th century. And so one of the major collectors at the time was the artist Diego Rivera, who actually, his materials became the focus of the first major exhibition of these figures in an art context. This really brought a lot of attention to the region that you would think would sort of stimulate archaeological research. Unfortunately, it happened nearly simultaneous with the archaeological discovery of the Gulf Coast Olmec. The folks along the Caribbean side of Mexico and that major bend there of the Mexican coast, and during the same period of time, some archaeologists began to actually define Mesoamerica as a cultural region. And unfortunately, the discovery of the Olmec led people to sort of fuse the two, where Mesoamerica became defined by the fact that it was everything descended from the Olmec. The problem is that the imagery in West Mexico, the figures there, look really very different from the Olmec, and that just really couldn't be accommodated in the way that people thought about the archaeology at the time. And so West Mexican materials were, alas, ejected from membership within Mesoamerica. So this over the next few decades, this narrative emerged where West Mexico was dominated by the supposed cult of the dead, where there's nothing else in West Mexico except a bunch of tombs and these mysterious ceramic figures down within them. So early excavations they really stalled out as people began to shift their attention elsewhere. And unfortunately, with the absence of archaeologists and professional research, the absence of art historians as well, I should add, um, looting, uh, interestingly, emerged and really occurred on a major scale. So the looting of artifacts, their trafficking into the hands of collectors or dealers elsewhere in Mexico or the United States or Europe really experienced a great and destructive surge. By the 1960s, a different narrative was beginning to emerge of West Mexican society as permeated with religious figures known as shamans, whose roles and activities were thought to potentially be illustrated by the hollow ceramic figures. So figures with animal heads were seen as shamans transforming into animals as they traveled to the underworld. Models of buildings were now seen as houses of the dead, mirroring those in life. What looked like warriors were actually shamans guarding a tomb. So, an important assumption through these interpretations is that the figures were mortuary offerings, specifically made for the tomb, and thus feeding this whole concept of a cult of the dead. Now, the this narrative has been challenged. Really began in the 1970s with excavations by Mexican archaeologists in a couple of locations. I have a slide here that again has these sort of white lines against a black background that hopefully makes these stand out a little better. But Mexican archaeologists worked in the state of Jalisco, up in the highlands, and there are two key excavations that were very important for us. There is, you can see on the left, a cemetery at a place called Tabachines. And the cemetery includes, as you might be able to see there, a whole raft of profiles seen from the side of a number of these shaft tombs. They're very modest ones. They're sort of boot shaped with just a shaft of maybe just 3 or 6 feet down that turns sideways into the chamber. And you can see a number of them all sort of laid out side by side. You can see that there are minor variations between them. And then at the bottom underneath, you see a couple of these sort of in plan seen from above. And you might have one or two individuals, or maybe a few who've been sort of pushed to the side to make room for the next one. So these are family tombs that are being reused to some degree over time. Now you'll notice to the right-hand side of the slide is another one of these tombs, but it is far more elaborate. It is deeper. Has two chambers to either side. And this is from a location known as Huitzilapa. And you can see at the very bottom there, two chambers side by side, connected by the shaft in the middle. And each one has several individuals, and it has, you might be able to make out a wealth of pottery vessels that would have been filled with food or drink. And then there are other objects in there, like some of those ceramic figures. Now, these ceramic figures, they can be images of people, animals. Like I said, they can be models of architecture, but they occur more often in tombs like those at Huitzilapa. In fact, these excavations by these Mexican archaeologists really established that you have this dichotomy between cemeteries of modest tombs out in the rural areas, almost certainly serving small villages, small communities of farmers. But then you also have these deep and elaborate tombs with much, much more wealth in them, and much more in the way of imported objects that are being constructed, dug underneath buildings. They're being found, in fact, under what we now know to be public architecture. And you'll see a few examples of these momentarily. Now, for those of you wondering about these figures, right, have I heard of these shaft tomb figures before? Well, you very well may have. They've been looted and trafficked in the thousands. There was a particular period in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when very large numbers of them came into Los Angeles, into Southern California anyway. And among many of their collectors were a number of Hollywood actors. And some of these figures also ended up into the stage sets for a number of movies that they were used in advertising. So you can see, of course, Alfred Hitchcock with one of the objects of interest in the movie North by Northwest, with the figure there being held. That's one of those from West Mexico. Those of you a little bit closer to my age or beyond may well remember the use of these figures in Kahlua ads. All of the ones you see in the ads right here, these are examples from West Mexico, from the personal collection accumulated by Jules Berman. And as I said, these figures would also show up now and again in different Hollywood productions, whether TV series or movies. So the figures really occurred in large numbers, and they were becoming pretty widely known, and they were really being collected in staggering numbers by people. Now, besides the work of other archaeologists within Mexico, foreign archaeologists have also contributed to changes in our understanding of these. The archaeologist Phil Weigand identified a number of ceremonial centers within the Tequila Valleys during reconnaissance over a period of from 1970 to 2000, followed by excavations at the largest center, known as Los Guachimontones. Now, my work began in the early 1990s, beginning with some of these small-scale surveys, test excavations, but then I excavated a fortified center known as Llano Grande, and then more extensive excavations at the larger ancient town of Navajas. In recent years, I've been working with Mexican archaeologist Berenice Heredia, who took over the project at Los Guachimontones after the death of Weigand. Now, we got a few images here that actually give you a sense of what have been excavated in recent years. You have some major architecture at the site of Los Guachimontones. In the upper left, you can see an example of one of the circular forms of architecture, which we think to be a kind of temple. To the right-hand side, you can see a ball court used for playing a rubber ball game, well known throughout other areas of Mesoamerica. And then the bottom image may look a little surreal. It is a rainy season photograph from above. You can see the major difference that occurs when the rainy season begins. We have everything turns dramatically green, and you can really see from this vantage point the circular form of this kind of architecture. There's a central pyramid or altar surrounded by about, in this case, maybe some 10 or so platforms, each one of which would have been the basis for a perishable superstructure made out of wood and thatch. My own excavations at the site of Navajas give us some more examples of these. We have another one of these circles mapped out to the right, and you can see from the red lines pointing to the photographs a couple of the buildings that we excavated. And as you can see, these are flat platforms. They don't represent the entire construction, which would have been all this additional material up above it. Now, these communities could number into the thousands. The site of Los Guachimontones is the largest that we know of, with several thousand people. Navajas, maybe 1,000 or so, and still smaller centers as well. Now, clearly, these are not really the small, leaderless, rural village societies posited many years ago, but the shamanism and the cult of the dead narrative has proven strikingly stubborn to kill. This led me to move beyond the excavations I've worked on to carry out analysis of the imagery, of the figures themselves. Something that a kind of work that's often done by art historians who are a little better trained than I at this sort of work. But I've learned a great deal from many of my colleagues in how to go about doing this. I particularly like the two figures that you see in the center of this slide. They really illustrate a number of points that I'd like to make. This is a male-female pair. They would have been found together in one of these tombs. Which is a frequent theme among these figures, the idea of these pairs. Now, they're impressive. They're both maybe about, say, 60 centimeters, how should I put that? Maybe like 2 feet high, among the most elaborate of their kind. They don't really get much nicer than you see right here. But take a look for a moment at what they each hold in their hands. The male holds a vertical bar with a little disc on top, with a central nub in the middle and 4 little ones equally spaced around it. The female is equally interesting. She's holding a triangular object, sometimes called a fan. Let's zoom in here, though, on these two objects. You can see then that the staff being held by the male figure, you zoom in much more closely, you can get a better look at it, and you can see that it's a miniaturized version of the circular temple architecture shown in an example, a model in the lower left. The female, the fan that she holds, this is not she's not this sort of delicate shrinking violet just fanning herself. That object is not a fan, but rather more like objects that would be held in the hands by some of the people you can see climbing these poles in the lower right. Sometimes these two images are essentially combined, where we find an image of the architecture with one of these poles coming out of the central altar. So essentially what you're looking at here are two figures, a male and a female. They each seem to hold objects that are used in rituals that are carried out within this circular temple architecture. So I think these elaborate figures are in a sense giving us a sense of what these figures may be representing in some cases. In some cases, they may be pointing to the roles, the authority of some of the people within the tombs. And we have found that the figures that have the most elaborate clothing and objects are actually found in the larger and wealthier tombs. Now, there have been a number of changes in how we have to interpret the figures, and that has come with increasing archaeological excavation. Now, when objects were being looted out of their tomb context, when they were being trafficked to other regions, for instance, then we lose all that information about where the figures were found, what they looked like, how they were arranged, and you lack all that information that is just standard for archaeological, an actual excavation. And as it turns out, excavation and even studies of collections in museums have really begun to provide a lot of decisive evidence that the figures were not made specifically for the tombs. Peter First, for instance, noticed long ago that many of the figures in museum collections showed signs of use wear, and many excavations have encountered incomplete figures now in the tombs. Bob Pickering has examined some 2,000 pieces at different museums, and he's quantified this at about 20%. So some 20% of pieces in museums show signs that they were scuffed, that they had undergone some kind of wear, most likely in the tomb. My own excavations at Navajas have recovered figure fragments from within the circular temple groups. On the, as you can see, several pieces on the far left. On the right, you can see an arm from one nearly complete figure that was found in a house, an everyday house at Los Guachimontones, where it is believed to have been displayed. The image in the middle, I believe we use this as an image advertising the talk, shows a figure that has been excavated from the interior of one of these circles, from inside an altar where it was actually deposited as a kind of offering. Now, what all this indicates, right, is that by relying upon objects that had no context, that had been taken out of tombs illegally, I'll add, and then trafficked across distances where they lost any associated information, we came to believe that figures had to be specifically associated with the tombs, with death, with mortuary themes. But that's not the case. Of course, you're only going to find complete objects when they are in a nice, protected environment like a tomb. In truth, excavations are now finding these figures in broken forms in people's trash heaps, inside houses, inside temples. So in other words, the figures were being worn, they were scuffed, they were broken, they were discarded. Only a small subset ever ended up within the tomb. There's a lot of implications then that go along with this, right? I mean, if the figures were not tailor-made for the tombs, then they did not necessarily refer to death-related activities. And all this forces us to really rethink how are we supposed to go around about the interpretation of these figures and the models. So let's take, just as a hypothetical here, let's take a look at some of the figures that have been found, that have been taken out of these tombs and are currently in museum collections worldwide. If we just look at the 5 examples here, we have a house model in the upper left with some people inside it. We have a figure in the middle who seems to be holding a cup, and he has a couple of what look like heads coming off of sort of these like straps coming off of his body, and those are most likely trophy heads. He's wearing a kind of helmet there with a little horn on it that we usually find with warriors. You can see a woman in the upper right holding a cup, and in the lower right you can see a dog, a very common figure. Over to the left, you actually see someone in a very difficult position. You have a male, You'll notice he actually holds the same kind of headdress as the central figure, so he's also a warrior, but he's bound, right? He is tied up. His hands are bound behind him. There's a rope going around his neck, leading down to around his feet, his ankles. He's a prisoner, right? He's been taken captive at some point. So we need then to think about how these figures are being interpreted. Now, political or other kinds of artwork elsewhere in Mesoamerica, they tend to occur in large public settings in the form of murals, architectural embellishments like carvings, panels, or sculptures. These West Mexican figures, you can see they're so much smaller, right? And I think they show a lot of the same kinds of topics, the narrative topics, as those seen in the monumental formats. The big difference is these small figures are portable. They can be pulled out, used, and then put away again. They can be arranged into groups, juxtaposed with others, and used to create a narrative. So for example, if we take a look at the figures right here, you could come up with one sort of narrative combining the central figure as a warrior with the captive in the lower left, perhaps telling a story of a warrior and the capture of an enemy, or perhaps the same figure and how they were warrior one minute and they were an unfortunate captive the next. That could be a very different story from that told by combining the central figure with, let's say, the house, where people are inside and communicating. So we have to take a different approach with the interpretation of the figures. Instead of having a narrative all laid out for us in a single sculpted panel or on a mural, let's say, in a public setting, we have to consider about how these figures might have been combined in different settings. I don't think I'm imagining all this. This argument is not out of place within what we know about Mesoamerica more broadly. In parts of highland Guatemala today, for instance, the Maya, small Maya communities in that area will annually carry out, they'll enact historical dramas that have survived from, in many cases, the prehistoric period. For example, there is the Rabinal Achi, which is actually a play, a theatrical play that is enacted by people in the community each year. They act out the roles of historical individuals from the 15th century. The story revolves around a warrior who is in fact captured by others. He's sort of chastised. He engages in banter with his captors, and is eventually sacrificed. That's the story that's being enacted. And the survival of this form of theater really rather hints at the kinds of narrative storytelling that really took place in public spaces. We're just used to thinking about it as something being sort of read off of large sculptures or other narratives where it's already been all put together for people. We can also take an example a little closer to where I work. Um, the the 16th century chronicle called the Relación de Michoacán. This is a text that was recorded in within just a couple of decades after the Spanish conquest of the large Tarascan Empire of Western Mexico. The Purépecha people of Michoacán, who of course still around today, were the primary inhabitants of the people of this empire. Now, the Relación de Michoacán tells, it has a number of elements to it, historical and descriptive about the Tarascan Empire and the Tarascan people. But the Relación also begins with the explicit statement that the history that it tells, that is written down in the Relación, that story was actually read aloud on the occasion of the annual ceremony called the Equata Conscuoro. So when the Tarascan Empire was still in existence, was still in force, there would be this annual festival, and as the quote there on the slide notes, the this celebration was an occasion when the main priest would recount the origins of the empire. They would give the genealogies of the rulers. They would talk about negotiations between different communities, about sacrifices, about battles that were critical moments in the history of the empire, and so on. And then once it was all over, lesser priests would then leave. They travel around the empire and go into smaller and smaller communities and repeat the stories. So this was a very effective way of spreading sort of the official history of the empire and making sure that people across the empire were aware of how this had taken place. Now, I want to illustrate how some comparative evidence for how I think this might have worked. Um, Obviously the theme of studying storytelling archaeologically may be a tough sell, right? How am I supposed to ever show you, convince you that this is how how these figures were being used? Well, I want to get this across by comparing the themes likely presented in the figures with those in another Mesoamerican art medium, namely the Mixtec screenfold codices from Oaxaca. These are books. They open as you see here, kind of accordion style, and they could actually be set up physically standing. And in fact, according to 16th century sources like Francisco Burgoa, these codices were publicly displayed and then read to audiences by religious figures, priests. People like John Monahan, Mark King, and John Pohl have all written on this subject. And in the case of the Mixtec codices, it's a little bit less of an argument to make there because we have this historic evidence talking about this is how they were used. But I think it provides an example of something that likely happened much, much earlier. I do not choose the Mixtec codices for comparison because I think there's any special relationship to the earlier cultures of Western Mexico. I choose them because they're a single collection of Mesoamerican artwork that really encompasses this whole range of narratives that I think are also represented in the Western Mexican figures. This is probably because they were both small and really localized political groups with rather similar sorts of concerns. So let's take a look here. We have, for instance, on the right-hand side, we have a page from a Mixtec codex that shows the birth of elites. They're coming out of a sacred tree. This is certainly something that is depicted in the West Mexican models. We can take a look on the left-hand side. In the upper left, you can even just see a little triangular roof from one of the architectural groups and a number of people standing around it. And they're looking at the tree, which is coming out of the center of the patio, just like the temples we talked about. And you see this big tree coming out of it with birds all over it. Another one is in the lower left. So my argument then would be that these ceramic models, such as this one, they're not just, let's say, portraying the architecture with a tree at the center in a sort of static representation, but this is specifically a narrative, a myth of creation set in the architectural space. A certainly very important theme is that of birth and of kinship relationships. And elsewhere in Mesoamerica, recording this, placing this in genealogies like you see in the Mixtec codices, this was critical for demonstrating their right to rule. So if you take a look on the right-hand side, we have a couple of images where you have, let's see, we have the topmost image here. There is a, let's see if I can get my laser pointer working. Okay, here we go. So here we have parents, the two figures here, seated on a platform with steps, and their names are located here, and they're being linked by a series of footprints to their child over here to the right. Further below, we have a somewhat more graphic depiction showing the mother here and being linked to their child by an umbilical cord. This is further shown again in this other image to the lower right. This may help to explain many of the representations that we find in the figures out of West Mexico, where we might have groups of people portrayed together. In fact, this is a single piece where they are all connected as a single piece that was put into a kiln. One of the common themes, especially for representations of women in Western Mexico, is of a woman holding a child. Now, in the past, this has been sort of discussed as if it were sort of a quaint representation of the social role of women in West Mexican society. But this could also, if we look to other Mesoamerican societies for guidance, this may well be more of a parentage statement, something that is referring to a moment in the life cycle of an individual and maybe even establishing their genealogical bona fides. The couples that I mentioned earlier, male and female, they can be actually physically linked together as a single ceramic, or they can be separate pieces. But a common theme in Mixtec art is the marriage between elites. Both males and females among the Mixtec inherited their own line of positions of rulership, their own villages, the tribute that they were due by people who lived there. And so when a marriage took place between elites among the Mixtec, it was very much, it was more like a merger than a marriage. That it was bringing together two sets of property associated with their elite position. The ritual ball game is certainly portrayed in West Mexican figures like in the lower left, but it also appears in the Mixtec codices. And it's not a simple portrayal saying, yes, people played the game, but rather it's part of a longer narrative. It is part of a longer narrative that describes a series of rituals with political repercussions in which, for example, in the Mixtec accounts of the figure known as 8 deer, 8 deer performs or plays in the ball game, defeats his enemies, then goes on to do other things, and sort of this long string of events that then eventually culminate in his taking on the position of ruler of a community, which is itself a major theme in Mesoamerican art, that of rulers taking on a role, a position of authority. And this is commonly depicted, usually by showing the person taking on the position being seated on a throne, on a seat, or on a mat, all of which were symbolically referring to taking a position of rulership. And this is a rather common theme occurring among West Mexican figures as well. This one is really great for illustrating a double standard that can be seen in how we have gone about interpreting West Mexican figures. Scenes like these on the left in Western Mexico, of a little house with some people in it, they've been described as these quaint domestic scenes. But similar scenes of people in an architectural context, like you see on the right-hand side here, these are known to be, based on the written context, they're known to be conferences but consultations between elites as elites go ahead and engage in negotiations. Um, the double standard here is really quite evident in this pairing. Warfare, another common theme in Mixtec codices, and it's usually depicted not with just a couple of warriors facing each other, but actually in an architectural setting where the things that are at stake in the battle are actually portrayed. And we have that in several of these kinds of images in Western Mexico. The one you see here shows a hilltop with a just barely visible house, a roof here, and a person in the center that is sitting atop that central circular architecture, like we have in our temples. And there's an array of warriors holding shields and spears down below it, and more generalized melee down below. So once again, a depiction that might be seen as isolated because it's a single object probably needs to be thought of instead as part of a longer narrative of activities. Warfare has its consequences. Warriors would, one of the common points of warfare in Mesoamerica was not necessarily conquest of territory, but the taking of captives. And we have here a couple of examples of Mixtec codices showing the taking of captives in the very same manner that you see to the in the upper left, where they have grabbed their victim by the top knot of their hair, something that I am immune to since I don't have any hair. But the same thing is happening here, where they're grabbing a victim, they're about to clobber them, perhaps take them captive, like you see in the lower left. And I think this last example, it's kind of interesting. It is the only one out of all the events that I've just been talking about that actually has anything to do with death or funerary activities at all. Here we see on the right-hand side, we have someone who's died. They're being depicted as a bundle. That's the preparation for they're going to be interred, perhaps inside architecture. Here we have a little bundle and another one next to it, and they are in fact atop a giant stone platform, a temple. Well, in the case of Western Mexico figures, we have those like you see here with one person laid out horizontally, a group of people around them apparently doing something with the body. And then in the lower left here, you have something more like a coffin that is being carried on to part of the architecture, presumably for burial, probably into one of those shaft tombs that was found underneath architecture. So we can just wrap up here with a couple of points. The figures out of Western Mexico, although they've very much been discussed in terms of what sort of story they might be telling about death, about the underworld, about mortuary, funerary activities of some sort, there's really no reason that the figures need to be referring to death or a cult of the dead at all. This is more about telling stories to the living. Whereas in later periods of Mesoamerican history, people would have used books to, let's say, communicate to elements of religion, of myths, to the community as a whole. In much earlier times, the time period we see being discussed with these shaft tombs and figures, this is a time when we don't have writing in very many places of Mesoamerica at all. The mnemonics being used are not a book, not a screenfold book with pictures that would be elaborated upon by a storyteller, but rather these are objects that could have been more flexible in the way that they were manipulated and combined to tell stories. Now, oral performance may be very difficult to address archaeologically. It may be hard to imagine how we're ever going to dig up storytelling, right, or a narrative of some kind. But the thing is, we do have other things available to us. We have the objects, the mnemonics being used. We have architectural spaces where they would have taken place. So we do have a number of features that we can use to address these kinds of topics. Oral performance, just like ritual or other sorts of political speeches, it still needs to be very much part of our approach to remains in West Mexican's past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Beekman, for sharing your research and your thoughts on Western Mexican archaeology with us tonight. For those of you in the audience, now is a great time to type questions into the Q&A, and we will have time to answer some of your questions. I have a couple, but I will be patient. We will start with a question in the Q&A. Other than the common imagery in art, what kinds of similarities or interactions do we see between people in Western and Eastern Mexico throughout this time period? Do we see examples of trade, for example?
Trade. We have some examples of trade, some things like jade, for instance, coming from all the way over in Guatemala. We have some things that might be better thought of not as trade, but as shared belief systems. So, for example, a very common figure at this time period in throughout parts of Mesoamerica is that of the old fire god. Which is usually depicted as this old man. He's got wrinkles and he's hunched over, and he's holding usually a big vessel on his back that would be used as like an incense burner, and he has a few little characteristics like that. And it probably has something to do with emerging out of the volcanism that was so common throughout Western and Central Mexico. The same deity shows up both in the West and in Central Mexican cities like Teotihuacan.
I have a question about, you were talking about how some artifacts made their way into pop culture, which is great to raise awareness of ancient life in Western Mexico. But the negative is potentially looting and a black market for items because they are popular. And inspired by you connecting that central figure and the artifacts around it, I wonder if you think that some of the artifacts found at your site or other sites, are there things that could be missing because of looting practices in the past, or stories that maybe aren't told? Like, for example, naturally, some of the architecture is missing because it's organic. But I'm wondering if you can talk about potentially stories that aren't preserved.
Well, you could sort of think of if these figures are really being used in storytelling like this as narratives, which is actually hinted by this figure that I have on the screen, actually. And an interesting example of a figure who's actually been nicknamed the storyteller. But when a tomb is opened up and people take objects out and let's say traffic them somewhere there where they'll be sold to a dealer, all the connections between them are lost. And so, in a sense, you could sort of think of every time a tomb is looted and those things are taken out, what you've done is you just erased the only history that we have of that person or that family, most likely, that was from that tomb. That because those objects were very much part of a larger narrative, right? A story, a genealogy, a recounting of, in some case, probably longer epics, really. So, so the loss of that material is really staggering. Now, let's say you take that that problem with a few figures and you multiply that by estimates that, well, all these estimates are going to be I don't know, not speculative, but we do have numbers. But one estimate is there's something like 10,000 of these figures that were trafficked out of Mexico and ended up into private hands, collectors, maybe eventually ending up in public collections. So if you think about that, you can really start to get a sense of the enormity, how much has been lost.
Thank you. Our next question in the chat, would you be able to give an example of volcanism's influence on the region or belief systems?
Well, I think the old fire god that I was mentioning is a great example. It portrays, you have this old man, he has this incense burner on his back. He is, in a sense, a volcano. You have this space in the back that would be used for burning things. And one thing I always thought was pretty interesting was how the old fire god becomes really, really popular in central Mexico right after the two volcanic eruptions at Popocatépetl and at Xitle, both areas around the Central Basin where Mexico City is today. So you can sort of see perhaps how volcanic events might have left a really big mark on people's memories.
Our next question, are any figures coming from areas to the west, specifically near the towns of, you'll have to excuse my pronunciation,
Oh,
Colima,
sure.
Tecolotlán, Tenemaxtlan, Ameca, or Cocula?
Okay. I know the area that they're talking about. It's sort of just a bit southeast of the area I've been talking about here today. And there are certainly tombs of the sort, figures of the sort that that have been found in that location. You can find occasionally pieces, let's say, in museums that have retained a claim that they came from towns like those, Ameca, for example. And so so yeah, sometimes you can actually trace this back. One thing I've been doing in my copious free time is I've been working with a broader project out of the Getty Research Institute, a number of scholars and colleagues who have been looking at really the trying to assemble what we know from every stage in this process, from the looters themselves, how they talk about the process of looting, how they find tombs, how they, take things out of them, how they find things, how they traffic them, let's say, to the United States border, the process of by which dealers in the US would then take these in, catalog them, assign a dollar value to them. And then, of course, what happens then? They sell them to private collectors. Sometimes some that I know of would do things like give them as gifts to family members or to a museum that they would like to establish a broader relationship with. And so these sorts of it's a fascinating element of provenance research that museums have become much more concerned with, and in the case of the Parthenon, you guys have done some great work with doing the work, looking at researching these, tracking down folks within Mexico who would take these back, because that whole process becomes practically a diplomatic effort at some point. It's not a simple process.
We're ringing quite a bell for me here at the Parthenon. Our next question, are there any shared elements between the shaft tomb cultures and the Chupiquaro culture? Is there evidence of interaction?
Yes, there is a couple different types. If we just sort of stick with the tombs, shaft tombs and figures are actually found in the Chupiquaro area. What's known as Chupiquaro culture is quite a bit like what I've been talking about here. That for a long time we just thought it was a bunch of people making pots, and located in the states of Guanajuato and Michoacan, more or less halfway between where I work and, say, Mexico City. And now we know about these sort of simple early shaft tombs that were built there, figures rather like these, different stylistically, but a rather similar idea. In fact, there's even that same dichotomy where some people are buried in cemeteries and then some people are buried under architecture. So there's some social parallels. And just a month ago or so, I was in Mexico City actually talking about some other comparisons, namely the presence of big circular burial mounds, which actually link where I work, an early stage of the stuff where I'm working, with Chupiquero, and even with central Mexico. If anybody goes to Mexico City, um, Teotihuacan is great, no question, but I encourage you to go and see the site of Cuicuilco, which is actually a gigantic circular burial mound, or mound, not so much a burial mound, but a big sort of temple, central altar and things that's actually very reminiscent of more Western kinds of archaeology.
Next question starts off with a great compliment, I want to say. I read your book, Waves of Influence, last year. So this was
Oh,
great to get an update on the state of the field of West Mexican archaeology. And they do say this may be an outdated question, so apologies. Do you identify any similarities in West Mexican burial traditions similar to those in South America?
mhm.
That there have been discussions about some cultural similarities between West Mexico and Peru that have been hypothesized, but also debunked.
Sure. Um, so in the past, what we tended to do is we sort of drew a big circle around Ecuador and Peru, and then another big circle around West Mexico, and we compared anything and everything within those two areas. Um, what we tried to do in the book that the the person mentions is to try and zero in much more on the comparisons. So let's say what we find is that at the same time period, for instance, in two different areas on the coast of Ecuador, each one had different connections to different parts of Mexico, one to West Mexico and one to Southern Mexico. So the connections seem to be there. There's, I think, a good deal of evidence for that. But we have to get so much more refined about how we take a look at the questions. In one case, for example, they had a super good evidence, and even the transmission of things like maybe coca, the use of coca leaves and special little pots used to hold lime to help you consume them, connecting almost two individual communities between the coast of Ecuador and the coast of Western Mexico. So you know that you lose all that detail if you just try to do it at a big broad brush kind of level. West Mexico is sort of interesting just in the way it's connected with so many places. At one point, they're communicating up in the American Southwest, and another with central Mexico, and another areas really far away via the coast.
I want to be mindful of time. We still have plenty more questions. We will answer just maybe two more. Speaking of materials here, does the depiction of figures holding cups bolster the theories of pre-Columbian alcohol distillation in Western Mexico? And they are specifically referring to the trifid and gourd stills
Ooh,
discovered in tombs in Colima along with copitas.
yeah, very specific question there. Yeah, the you know, I've seen some different attempts to try and figure out what those vessels, those very specific vessels, were being used for. Yeah, there's an argument for sort of a distillation. There's a rather simpler argument that they might be um, connected with processing beans in some way. I don't think vessel residues are quite my thing. I don't think I get to work so much with that. I think the big thing about those vessels they're talking about in Colima is just how just the crazy sort of forms to them, and that they'll have, let's say, a big vessel like a enclosed sort of jar, and then these little spouts coming up, and they don't lead to the mouth, they lead to a whole other jar, and then a spout on top of that. So these are some pretty elaborate vessels that I think whatever went in them must have been pretty special. I think that's got to be the point. I think of that more than the vessel itself as having some specific sort of pattern of or kind of production use to it. I think of the like one vessel, the form that comes from South America is what's called a stirrup spout, which has a sort of a globe down below, and then this double tube, and then a little spout off of that. And the point is you can kind of move it back and forth, and it sort of shakes things up, maybe froths things up in there. And it seems to be one of the kinds of pots that's used for chocolate drink, for instance. So I'm guessing, we love our pots as archaeologists, but I think what went in the pot was probably a lot more important.
Final question. As I mentioned, we still have more coming in, so I apologize for for the time here. Our final question, I think inspired by one of your images shown. Can you give us more information on how the ball game was played, why, and what was the outcome / results?
Oh yeah. So the rubber ball game, it starts so early. I mean, the very earliest sedentary communities that we know of in southern Mexico have a ball court. Um, and it just seems to be this really fundamental feature of Mesoamerica. And uh, the we have to really think of it as kind of like football, like soccer, right? Because you could just play it in the street somewhere. You don't need a court, right? It's pretty basic in that sense. But you could also build these big, gigantic stadiums and really make a big deal out of it. So it seems to have a whole lot of functions to it, socially speaking. As for how it's played, geez, we seem to have a lot of examples of that. I mean, our best information may come from places like Sinaloa in Western Mexico, where it's still played. And what's been found there is that it has just this shockingly complex scoring system, where you not only can make points by bouncing it off your hips, or off something other than your hands or feet usually, and that would have been painful as anything, because these are solid balls, right? This is wrapped rubber. This is not something inflated. So it's bang, hits you in the hip, and you're knocking it into your opponents or against a wall to score. But then you can also take away from the other side's score. So it seems to be really elaborate, and trying to reconstruct that from just the court can be pretty difficult. But when we have courts that are showing up right next to temples, um, or those that may be among a bunch of houses, I think the different kinds of courts are probably telling us something very different about the kinds of role that it played, right? Is it a little more informal, or was it given all sorts of additional symbolic meaning?
All right. Thank you very much for answering some of our questions today. Dr. Beekman, if you don't mind, can you stop sharing your screen? I
I can
know
do
some
that.
participants are able to see our ASL interpreter,
Ah,
and I was hoping that we can have us all on screen here for our
okay, great.
final goodbye. So thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us tonight, and some very thoughtful questions for our speaker. Thank you to the Archaeological Institute of America for sponsoring tonight's Russell Lecture, and to Metro Nashville Government Centennial Park Conservancy for funding our educational programming and having a museum project that we can continue to discuss even about a year after repatriation of our pre-Columbian collection. Last but not least, thank you, Dr. Beekman, for sharing your work, your research with us tonight. We really appreciate taking the time to share more about artifacts of Western Mexico with us.
I'm
So
super
thank
happy
you,
to do
everyone.
so. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.